Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to the channel. I've been using Apple's 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro pretty much every day for the last 6 months. And in this video, I wanted to give you my long-term review, covering what I like, what I don't like, and then ultimately giving you my opinion on whether you should buy Apple's most powerful laptop ever. So with that in mind, let's get into it. So I wanted to start by telling you what I use my MacBook for and why I chose it over other Mac options. First off, I'm someone who's really entrenched in the Apple ecosystem. I have an iPad, an iPhone, and an Apple Watch, so a Mac was always going to be my first choice. Plus, I've always owned Macs for years since my first PowerBook G4. P.S. Design review of MacBooks through the years coming soon to the channel, so definitely stay tuned for that. Prior to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, I was actually using a MacBook Air, believe it or not. But to be honest, that ran its course and just wasn't powerful enough for what I needed it for. I actually had that laptop for over 10 years, so I got some pretty decent value out of it. I also used my MacBook for a variety of different things, which is going to be useful as part of this review, as it will cover a large majority of use cases that most people will want something like this for. I use productivity tools a lot to manage my business. I use communication tools to stay in touch with clients and do video conferencing. And then I spend most of my time on creative tools as well, making videos and doing my design work. So there's a lot to cover here, and that leads us nicely onto the specs for my machine. So I got this MacBook in mid-2020, but it's still the 2019 model. I went for the 2.4 GHz 8-core Intel i9 version with 64 GB of RAM. I also upgraded to the AMD Radeon Pro 5500M at 8GB, which also comes with the Intel UHD graphics card as standard. I also have a 1TB hard drive as well. So at this point, you're probably wondering what a 64GB RAM laptop feels like to use, and we're going to get onto that later. But first, let's talk about the design. So you can see how much bigger the 16-inch laptop is compared to my older laptops, and I wanted to cover why I went for the 16-inch MacBook Pro versus the 13-inch Pro or an iMac. At the time, I could only really afford one Mac, so I needed something really portable that was going to be powerful as well. The 16-inch was the best option for this because I could really max out the specs and create the ultimate portable powerhouse. So whilst it's big, it's actually super thin, which makes a huge difference, even when I add my Pro case protector onto it. By the way, there's a link to this hard case below. No, they're not sponsoring the video, I just absolutely love their cases. When it comes to the weight of the machine, the one thing I would say is that this is really heavy. It's not so heavy you wouldn't want to carry it around in a rucksack all day, but still, it is heavy, and to be honest, that surprised me a bit. Still, I'd personally much rather have a heavy, thin, powerful machine than a light, non-powerful one. Speaking of the thickness, one of the reasons Apple is able to achieve this is because they limit the ports they use. So on each side of the MacBook, you get 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, which are also USB-C compatible. And Apple have added back in a 3.5mm headphone jack, which is absolutely awesome. And I have to say, as someone that's a creator and constantly editing videos, this is such a nice touch. Apple have really listened to what people want and delivered on this. But in terms of ports, that's literally it. So I'm personally not someone that uses lots of peripherals. I don't even use a camera card, although that might change in the future. So it's really not a big deal for me. But if you are someone that uses a lot of ports and peripherals, then I don't think this should stop you buying a MacBook. There's tons of different hubs you can buy for less than $20, and you can just buy and plug in whenever you need. Also, consider that most people are probably going to use this laptop with a screen. I plug mine into my 5K LG display, which extends the amount of ports I have anyway. It means I can plug peripherals in permanently into the back of my screen if I wanted to. Go and check out my desk setup video for more details on this. Let's talk about the keyboard next, as this was a huge issue with previous Macs. Luckily, I was able to avoid pretty much all of these bad keyboards, but I did have a go on some and they just didn't work well, so I can understand people's frustration. I'm pleased to say though that this new Magic keyboard is awesome. It's genuinely my favourite typing experience on any keyboard, and you can just type so smoothly. I just find my fingers gliding over the keys, which is a result of Apple switching back to the old scissor switch mechanism that people loved so much. I get asked a lot, whether I'd consider moving to mechanical keyboard, and whilst I'd definitely like to try one at some stage, I honestly just can't see the point when my main keyboard is this good. Plus on this keyboard you get the touch bar. Now I know this will be a point of contention and people have pretty strong views about the touch bar, but honestly I love it. It can be a little bit glitchy from time to time, but to be honest that's a trade-off I'm willing to accept to have things so much more easily at your fingertips. It provides spelling suggestions, it lets you add emojis easily, and it honestly is a better experience for me. Plus on this one you have the physical escape key as well, which is definitely needed. Unlike most people, I think the touch bar is great, and I also think it's here to stay. Let me know what you think in the comments below. The other thing to mention here is that the trackpad is absolutely huge. Some people have asked whether it gets in the way when you're typing, and I can happily say it doesn't at all. I'm not sure whether I'm not touching it or whether it has some sort of special palm rejection software, but either way it works really well and doesn't get in the way. Also, because of its size, it means you can use it like an external trackpad in conjunction with an external mouse. So I use the MX Master 3 separately and tend to switch back and forth between the two pretty fluidly depending on what I'm doing. Sometimes you want to swipe, sometimes you want to scroll, and using the two together is great. By the way, check out my review of the MX Master 3 mouse if you want more details on that. The final thing to mention about the design is the new thinner bezels. If you look at some of the older MacBooks and also the 13-inch MacBook, the bezels are just too thick for my taste. I think this is an area where Apple actually needs to catch up versus the competition. Generally across all its machines, the chins and bezels are just way too thick, so I really hope this improves at some point soon. I'm pleased to say though that the 16-inch Pro is an exception to this, and Apple have made the bezels really streamlined. So let's talk about the performance next. Now this is going to be even more interesting now that the new M1 MacBooks have been released. I don't have a new M1 13-inch MacBook Pro, so I've had to rely on online benchmarks for this. There's actually a really great article from Apple Insider on this, which goes into much more detail. But in terms of the CPU, from what I can see, the M1 MacBook Pro actually marginally beats the Intel Core i9 within the 16-inch on Geekbench, with the Core i9 actually only beating the M1 chip on the multi-core Cinebench scores. Where the MacBook Pro 16-inch does still win by a significant margin though is in the GPU benchmarks, due to its dedicated AMD Radeon Pro graphics card, which leads by far. So if you're doing lots of work with visual graphics or wanting to use your laptop for gaming, then this is definitely something to think about. The other major point of consideration here is RAM, which to be honest is less well covered by articles I've read online. I went for the 64GB of RAM option because I'm someone that does a lot of app switching and multitasking. Part of the big reason that I didn't go for the 13-inch Pro is that I wanted a much better RAM performance, which maxes out at 32GB in the 13-inch version. If you're like me and you do a lot of video editing and graphics creation across multiple apps at the same time, then RAM is pretty important to you. So whilst I didn't feel like I needed 64GB right now, I wanted to future-proof my Mac for a good number of years. RAM basically increases the speed in which your processor can talk to other parts of your computer. So if you have less RAM, it can actually limit the speed of your processor. It's a little like having fiber broadband to your street, but then the last few meters isn't fiber optic, which just slows everything down. Anyway, overall the performance has been awesome and it churns through my video editing in 4K, which is probably the most intensive thing I do. So with the CPU, GPU and RAM combined, there's nothing better from Apple at the moment from my perspective that you can get in a portable format, even with the new M1 chips. In terms of other things to mention, let's start by talking about the battery life. Now the extra thickness to the new 16-inch MacBook Pro is actually in part due to a new battery, which is now the largest ever. In fact, it's now the largest legally allowed battery by commercial flights in the US. And to be honest, it shows. I'd say I'm getting an average of about 1.5 days of use out of it before needing to recharge, unless I'm doing something really intensive like video editing. Let's cover connectivity briefly because I've read some articles online where people have mentioned some Bluetooth connection issues. This isn't something I've found at all, and everything I've tried to connect my MacBook to has synced beautifully so far. And this is coming from someone that connects a lot of things wirelessly as well. Speaking of wireless, it's also good to point out that these Macs have Wi-Fi 6 compatibility, which most routers won't be compatible with for a few years, but it's great to know again in this area that my Mac is pretty future-proof. You've probably already seen this in some of the ads, but the 16-inch MacBook Pro microphone is also supposed to be studio-level quality. Whilst I don't use it for my YouTube videos, I do use it for video calls, and people have mentioned how clear the audio is. This leads us nicely on to some of the things I don't like about this machine. And to be honest, it's a short list, but these things are important. The first thing I don't like about the MacBook is the camera quality. It's just not good enough for a machine that's so advanced, and I really think it's a miss from Apple, especially with so many people now working from home. If I want to have a high quality video conference, I have to attach an external camera, which is a real shame. Speaking of which, it would be nice if there was Face ID as an option. Touch ID is okay and I don't mind it, but Face ID would have been a really nice addition. Another thing to mention about the design of the laptop is the viewing angle. I've mentioned this before, but I think Apple need to increase the viewing angle of their screens. I'm quite tall and sometimes I find the viewing angle of the screen quite restricted if I'm working straight from the laptop. Ironically, this never actually used to be a problem on earlier MacBook designs, and I'm going to be doing a video about this soon. The biggest thing though with this MacBook is the fan throttling. Now to be fair, this only happens when I'm editing in 4K, so I suppose it's fair enough. And using normal applications, I get zero fan noise. But given I spend a lot of my time editing, the fan is so often on and it can get really noisy. I think this is actually a result of previous models having thermal performance issues. So Apple has introduced a new cooling system which gives it 28% better cooling efficiency. But either way, I really hope this is something Apple can fix soon in a future software update as they get things working a bit more efficiently. So in summary guys, should you get one of these? Well, if you need a really powerful portable MacBook in the next year or two, then this is definitely the one to get. If you don't need so much power, then definitely get the ARM-based MacBook Air or the 13-inch Pro, especially if you're not a creator or do less on the graphics and content creation. Whilst the M1 MacBooks are definitely the future and seem super powerful on some initial benchmarks, right now they're still not optimized across a lot of apps, which means you could see some slower speeds initially. I spent a lot of my time in Adobe Creative Suite, so for me that's a big consideration. If though you think you can wait a year or two, then it might be worth it to see what Apple has in store for a 16-inch ARM-based Mac. That could be incredible, and it will also give developers a chance to optimize apps properly for the ARM architecture. So guys, that's it for this review video. Let me know what setup you guys have at the moment or what you're thinking of upgrading to. I'd also love to hear whether you guys are enjoying these videos, so remember to drop me a like if you are, or let me know in the comments below if there's any other videos you'd like me to do. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and remember to subscribe for more.